So as December the 6th, we celebrate St. Nicholas every December the 6th as a church. December the 8th, which is tomorrow, what do we celebrate as a church every December the 8th? It used to, it's a holy day of obligation when it's not connected so closely to a Sunday. We refer to it as the Immaculate Conception. Have we heard of that before? The Immaculate Conception. What is the Immaculate Conception all about? What is the Immaculate Conception? Is that how it is that Mary gave birth to Jesus as a virgin? No, don't confuse it with the virginal birth. The Immaculate Conception says that when Mary was conceived, the moment that Mary was conceived, she was conceived without original sin. So remember original sin, that great concept of St. Augustine? The question for persons in the church was, did Mary have original sin? Was Mary born with original sin? Because she was the mother of Jesus. She was the mother of God. Could the mother of God be born with original sin? And the answer by some was no. Mary had to have been free from original sin from the first moment of her life. So from the moment of her conception, she was free from sin. Let's think about the timing of this feast. So if we celebrate the Immaculate Conception on December the 8th, we all know what conception is. Conception, the moment that a person is conceived, is usually 9 months before that person is born, correct? So when do we celebrate Jesus' birthday? Jesus' birthday we celebrate on December the 25th. So back up 9 months. What is 9 months before December the 25th? That would be March the 25th. Do you know what the feast is of the church on March the 25th? Every December the 25th we celebrate Jesus' birth, Christmas. What do we celebrate every March the 25th? We celebrate Jesus' conception. Did you know that? We call it the Annunciation, when Mary came to the angel and told Mary, got news for you, you're pregnant. Back in the days before pregnancy tests, I guess we had angels. Right? So the angel came to Mary, and we celebrate that on March the 25th, Jesus' conception. And then when we celebrate Jesus' birth, 9 months later on December the 25th. Same with the Immaculate Conception. Follow me now. So we celebrate the Immaculate Conception on December the 8th. Can anyone come forward 9 months and tell me when it is we celebrate Mary's birthday as a church? Every year as a church, we celebrate Mary's birthday on September the 8th. So if we celebrate her birthday on September the 8th, we simply back up 9 months, and every December the 8th, we celebrate Mary's conception. So the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is celebrating the fact that it's an ancient belief of the Church since the 4th and 5th centuries that Mary is not like the rest of us, that there was something special about Mary. In the Eastern Church, the term that they came up with in the 4th century is that Mary was pre-purified. There was something about her where she was purified even before she was born. By the year 750, we were celebrating a feast of Mary's conception. We didn't call it the Immaculate Conception yet. But then different people started thinking about it, thinking, could Mary be born with original sin, or was Mary different from us in that respect? Once St. Augustine formulated the concept of original sin, we had to start thinking about who was born with original sin and who wasn't. Anyone in this church not born with original sin? According to St. Augustine, everyone in this church was born with original sin. St. Augustine simply came up with this concept. If you were saved by Jesus, that must mean that you were somehow bad. He said, let's call that original sin. In order for Jesus to save you, you must have been bad in some way. Let's call it original sin. Could Mary have been bad in any way? This is going to lead to a few theological difficulties we're going to see in a moment. So different people in the Middle Ages started this belief that Mary was born without sin. And they started preaching this. Good priests, good Franciscan priests started preaching that Mary was born without sin. Mary was born without original sin. Did everyone agree with this? No. In fact, there were some big theologians and preachers in the church who said, that is hogwash. People like Bernard of Clairvaux, a teacher, a theologian, said it's not possible for Mary to be born without sin. St. Albert, now Mary was not born without sin. She was a sinner like the rest of us in order for Christ to save her. St. Thomas Aquinas, we heard him, the 13th century theologian, he said, unless Mary sinned, she could not be redeemed. And so if Mary's redeemed, then Mary sinned in some way. St. Thomas of Aquinas disagreed with the Immaculate Conception. So follow me now. Here we have this disagreement in the church of some people preaching one thing, that Mary is born without sin, of other people saying another thing, that's not possible because if Mary didn't sin, then Mary wasn't redeemed. So where's all this going? Where's this conflict going? Fast forward to the 19th century. The year was 1854 that the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed. Pius IX had a problem. There was division in the church. Was Mary born with original sin or not? He made the decision, and what did he say? Mary was not born with original sin. She was immaculate from the moment of her conception. He settled the disagreement forever, right? Wrong. Which is why, once he proclaimed that Mary was born without original sin, what did he have to do to justify having said that? He had to proclaim himself infallible. And so the whole doctrine of papal infallibility, what does it date to? It dates to this doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. The church was divided. Some were saying Mary was born with sin, because if not, then she wasn't redeemed by Christ. Some were saying she was not born with sin. They finally settled in 1854, but the division persisted, so the Pope came out in 1870. He had those closest to him in the First Vatican Council say, the Pope is what? Infallible. Wow. So how interesting. We continue to be split on the issue, with different people believing different things. Protestants and the Anglicans tend to believe that the Immaculate Conception is not part of their beliefs. The old Catholic Church, which is what the American Catholic Church comes from, has no problem with the doctrine of Immaculate Conception, but we don't hold papal infallibility, right? For a pope to say something and then to say, oh, well, I can say that because I'm infallible. I cannot be wrong. That was an interesting new development in 1870, for a person to say, I cannot be wrong. Questions or comments? I see a hand. Loud voice.
I'm actually confused because I was raised Protestant, and I don't think Protestants believe in the concept of original sin. The reason I say that is because I wasn't baptized until I was 17 years old.
Ooh, how interesting. So the question has to do with, do our Protestant brothers and sisters believe in original sin? Who came up with the concept of original sin? It was Augustine in the 4th and early 5th centuries. So how interesting that even a concept like original sin, people could disagree on that.
Because isn't that why Catholics baptize babies?
Isn't that why Catholics baptize babies? That's often why Catholics baptize babies, because people think, what happens if that baby dies? Will that baby go to hell? Better to baptize that baby to make sure, if it was born with original sin, this way it's cleansed of original sin.
The Protestant belief is that you don't get baptized until you actually accept Christianity as your religion.
So
I didn't get baptized until I was 17.
So Becky says that she was not baptized until age 17 because raised as a Protestant, there was not this concern about original sin. For many of our Protestant brothers and sisters, what does that mean? That it's more important for them that a person makes his or her own decision to accept Christ. Isn't that what happens in many Protestant churches, right? If you believe in Christ, if you take Christ as your personal Savior and friend, then I invite you to go forward and be baptized. We don't do it without your consent. It's something that you have to choose. How interesting. So we have this division, Andy.
There's a Christmas movie, The Song of Bernadette. The Lords, where this young girl claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary, and the Roman Catholic Church didn't believe her. They wanted to know who taught her all this stuff and why she was saying this. And the priest asked her, well, have you asked her what her name is? Something to that effect.
So before you tell us the name, so Andy's saying that in Lourdes then there was an apparition to Bernadette, and the bishops were asking, well, did this woman who purportedly appeared to you, did she say what her name was? Andy, we're in suspense. What was her name?
Immaculate Conception.
She said, I am the Immaculate Conception. How fascinating. That fits within the 19th century. There was this fervor of apparitions throughout the church at places like Lourdes and at places like Fatima. How interesting that in one of the apparitions then...
And supposedly Bernadette didn't know what Immaculate or Conception meant.
There you go. So according to the story of Bernadette then, the woman who appeared to her said, I am the Immaculate Conception. How interesting. The timing was absolutely perfect insofar as the Pope could look at that and say, see, I told you, Mary was conceived without sin. Fascinating,
I
huh?
have a question. Because we push the controversy a little bit further, is it possible to say that we all were conceived without sin?
Gary says, can we push the controversy just a bit further and argue? Could a person argue that we were all conceived without sin?
We don't apply the concept of original sin, which is hard to imagine that God would send an unbaptized infant.
I agree with him.
I hear a few amens, right? Saying, people saying it's a little hard to believe that God would create a person sinful.
Yeah.
Because the book of Genesis, what does the book of Genesis say? Chapter 1, when God created things, God said, this is good. How interesting. So on the one hand, we have Genesis saying everything that's created is good. On the other hand, we have Augustine in the late 4th, early 5th century saying, got news for you. If Jesus saved you, you weren't born good. And so I think to answer Gary's question, before the 4th and 5th centuries, was there a notion of original sin in the church? It wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. How interesting. So to answer Gary's question more directly, could we believe that we're all born good? I suspect that a person could believe. You could take a look at that infant that you just gave birth to and say, is this infant bad or is this infant good? This infant is probably one of those good creations of God. But once you invent a notion like original sin, that takes you down certain roads, which conclude with things like division in the church over concepts like the Immaculate Conception. Mario, love ways. When we're born, we're completely clean, Mario believes.
I'm really concerned about the children that died, like 3 months later after birth.
How interesting. The Catholic Church has always said for a sin to be a sin, you have to choose to do it. You have to choose to sin in order for it to be a sin. Did that child choose to sin in any way? No. Yeah. There you go. So it seems there are various difficulties that we can talk about. We could stay after Mass for 3 hours talking about this. I have a feeling, right? Should we take a look at the scriptures for today before we jump into Mass?